By August, the creek had become a scar. Its bed lay split open beneath the sun-gray clay broken into plates sharp enough to cut a horse's fetlock. Cattle stood beneath the cottonwoods with their ribs showing too weak to bawl. Dust drifted through Rosebud Valley in long brown veils, settling over fences, roofs, and faces until rich men and poor men wore the same color. Then the geese came over the rise. 283 of them moved across the dead pasture like a slow white river, their broad bodies swaying, their voices rolling ahead of them in a confident chorus. They passed the bones of a steer and continued toward the only green place left in the valley, a spring-fed basin on Clara May Whitcomb's 10 neglected acres. At her fence, the people of Rosebud Crossing watched without speaking. Clary stood among the birds, broad-hipped and sun-browned, her skirts brushing the clover. Sweat darkened the cloth between her shoulders. One goose pecked gently at her boot, impatient for the water. Calvin Sterling sat on his bay horse beyond the gate. Dust coated his polished boots. His mouth had gone hard. 4 months earlier, he had laughed louder than any of them. 4 months earlier, the geese had been nothing but cracked eggs in the mud. The spring road into Rosebud Crossing had not yet dried when Hank Dorsey's freight wagon struck the washout. One wheel dropped so deep that the entire wagon lurched sideways. Crates slammed together behind him, and by the time he reached the mercantile, his face was purple with anger. 350 Toulouse eggs, he shouted, throwing open the first crate, brought all the way from St. Paul for Abernathy's hotel people near Yellowstone. The townsmen gathered around. The eggs were enormous, pale as old ivory, and nearly every shell carried a web of fractures. Patrick Rourke lifted one and turned it beneath the porch light. Dead already. Virgil Gable nodded from behind the counter. A cracked egg's fit for pigs if the stink hasn't got into it. Clary stood near the flour barrels with a sack of salt tucked against her hip. At 23, she had learned that a quiet woman drew questions, but a fat quiet woman drew conclusions. People decided she was lazy because she moved carefully, foolish because she rarely argued, and desperate because no man had offered to take her and her troublesome land together. Calvin Sterling leaned against the counter in a clean black coat. "Broken things do seem to find their way to the Whitcomb place," he said. A few men laughed. Patrick looked Clary up and down. "Better check the wagon springs before she loads herself in all those eggs." The laughter grew. Clary felt the heat rise under her collar. She could have left. That was what they expected, her lowered eyes, her heavy steps, the door closing behind her. Instead, she set down the salt and walked to the crate. She lifted one egg close to the window. The shell was cracked, but no moisture leaked through. Beneath the fracture, the membrane still held. Her grandmother had once repaired a duck egg split by a careless hen. Flour water, a little lime. 28 days later, the duckling had broken through the white scar. "What are you doing with them?" Clary asked. Dorsey spat into the mud. "Dumping them. I'll take them." For a moment, even the rain tapping the porch roof seemed to stop. Sterling smiled. "For what purpose I have pigs?" It was a lie, but a useful one. Dorsey waved toward the crates. "Take the whole miserable lot. Saves my back." By the time Clary had loaded the last crate, her arms shook. The men did not help. They watched from the porch as she braced each box against her wide hip, lifted and carried it through the mud. Clary's folly. Someone called as she drove away. "Goose Queen. 300 rotten breakfasts." She kept her hands steady on the reins. 350 eggs, 350 possibilities. Her land lay north of town, where the bunchgrass country dipped toward an old slough. Her father had spent 20 years cursing that basin. Cattle sank in it. Hay grew poorly around it. People called it Whitcomb's Sink until he died, then renamed it Clary's Wallow. Clary had never hated the basin. She had noticed how long it held water. She had noticed the clover, the sedges, the wild birds resting there during migration. Eliza Yellowtail had noticed too. The Apsialuk widow had stopped at Clary's place 2 weeks earlier on her way to trade repaired tack and dried chokecherries in town. She had knelt beside the slough and pressed her fingers into the clay. "This water comes from below," Eliza had said. "Men who measure land only by cattle will never understand it." Now Clary carried the crates into the barn one at a time. By lantern light, she sorted the eggs on flour sacks. 27 were shattered beyond saving. Others had deep breaks. Most held only fine cracks. She mixed flour paste with water and slaked lime, then worked until night became morning. Her thick fingers moved with astonishing care, pressing paste into fractures no wider than thread. Near dawn, Nels Halverson appeared in the barn doorway. The old Norwegian had been her father's friend. He took off his hat and stared at the rows of pale eggs. "Your grandmother's method," he said. Clary nodded. "Do you think it can work?" Nels lifted one egg, turning it gently. Some will die. I know, maybe many. I know that too. He looked toward the damp end of the barn. They need warmth, moisture, turning 4 times every day. Then that is what they'll have. Eliza returned before noon. Together, the 3 of them built long troughs from broken crates and fence boards. They packed the sides with straw, lined them with old blankets, and placed shallow pans of water beneath shielded lanterns. Eliza showed them where the earth breathed the most moisture. Nels marked every shell with charcoal so Clary could measure each quarter turn. Sterling arrived as they finished. He stood inside the barn, gloved hands clasped behind his back. "I came to renew my offer for this property," he said. "Taxes are due soon. A woman alone should know when to release a burden." Clary continued settling eggs into straw. "I'm not selling." His eyes moved over the troughs. "You intend to hatch money from garbage. I intend to give them a chance." Sterling's smile thinned. "Pride is a costly meal, Miss Whitcomb, and a woman your size ought to know the danger of an empty table." The words struck where he intended. Clary felt herself wanting to shrink, though she had spent her entire life being told she occupied too much space. She straightened. "You keep measuring me by what you think should fit," she said. "That is why you have never understood this land." Sterling's face changed. He walked out without another word. For 26 days, Clary turned the eggs, before sunrise, at noon, at dusk, at midnight. She repaired broken seals, replaced cooling stones, and removed spoiled eggs before their stink spread. Ben Rourke began watching through a crack in the barn wall. When she caught him, he did not laugh. "Can I help?" he asked. She let him fill those water pans. Then, 7 eggs spoiled in one night. Clary carried them outside and buried them beneath the cottonwoods. When she returned, she sat heavily on an overturned bucket. "What if I'm only keeping dead things warm?" she whispered. Nels placed one mended egg in her hands. "A cracked shell is not a grave unless you decide to bury it." Clary stared at the white scars crossing the shell. Then she rose and turned the eggs again. Near midnight, she heard a faint tapping. She held her breath. Tap, pause, tap. She lifted the egg to her ear. Something alive was striking from inside. Before dawn, the shell split along one of Clary's repaired lines. A wet gosling pushed through and collapsed into the straw, trembling and exhausted. Then another egg began to tap, and another. Soon the barn filled with the thin, urgent voices of new life. Outside on the road, Calvin Sterling reined in his horse. He listened to the peeping in the darkness, and the contempt left his face. In its place came calculation. For 3 days the barn did not sleep. Shells cracked at every hour. Goslings pushed through white seams Clary had painted with flour, and lime-wet bodies trembling beneath the lanterns. Some emerged strong enough to lift their heads at once. Others lay gasping in the straw while Clary warmed them between her palms and prayed without words. By the 4th morning, the hatching had slowed. Nels counted the living birds twice. 283, he said. Clary looked over the crowded pens. The number seemed impossible. The barn had once held only dust-broken tools and the winter smell of old hay. Now it moved and peeped like one enormous breathing creature. Ben Rourke stood inside the doorway with an armful of straw. "That one keeps pushing everybody away from the feed," he said, pointing to a broad-chested gosling. Then set another pan down. Ben grinned. "I think I'll call him General Grant." Eliza Yellowtail, kneeling beside a weak bird, raised an eyebrow. "That is a large name for something that still falls over its own feet." "General, then." The name remained. Clary's days became a blur of water buckets, chopped greens, boiled yolks, and damp bedding. She rose before sunrise and often found herself still working when the coyotes began calling beyond the ridge. The goslings followed her wherever the pen allowed. They climbed over her boots, tugged at her skirt, and settled against her when she sat down from exhaustion. In their small, unquestioning world, her body was not excessive. It was warmth. A broad lap meant more room. Strong arms meant full water pails. Heavy steps meant the person who brought food was coming. Ben arrived every afternoon after finishing his chores. At home, he was the youngest of 5 boys, useful mostly when someone needed a message carried or a gate closed. In Clary's barn, she listened when he noticed a gosling breathing too quickly or one refusing to eat. He named dozens of them. A crooked-legged bird became Hoppy. A gray gosling with one white wing became Preacher. A small female that bit Nels's thumb was named Queen Victoria. Nels complained about every name and remembered them all. When the birds were old enough to leave the barn, Eliza helped Clary prepare the basin. They drove willow stakes into the firmest ground and wove branches between them to keep the flock away from the sucking mud. Virgil Gable passed on the road and watched Eliza testing the soil with a long stick. "You people got a sign for when the rain's coming," he called. Eliza did not look up. "No, I looked at the roots in the grass. You could have done the same." Clary covered a smile with her hand. The first release happened beneath a clear May sky. Clary opened the barn doors, expecting hesitation. The goslings poured into the light like water from a broken barrel. They stumbled over one another, flapped unfinished wings, and rolled down the slight slope toward the basin. When they reached the clover, the flock spread wide, tearing eagerly at green leaves. Several plunged into the shallow water and emerged looking astonished by their own bodies. Ben laughed until he had to sit down. Clary stood beside him, watching the gray mass move across the wet ground. Her father had called the basin a curse. Sterling had called it a burden, yet every feature that made the land useless for cattle made it perfect for the geese. By the beginning of June, the clouds vanished. At first, no one worried. Dry spells belonged to Montana's summers. Men repaired fences, sharpened scythes, and waited for the western sky to darken. It did not. The wagon roots hardened. Mud became dust. The bunch grass faded from green to yellow, then from yellow to the gray-brown color of old rope. Nels stood at Clary's fence one evening, studying the empty sky. "It has forgotten how to carry water," he said. By July, the valley began to suffer. The creek narrowed to a string of stagnant pools. Hay prices doubled, then tripled. Cattle crowded around failing wells, their ribs pressing against their hides. Ranchers sold animals for whatever Sterling's company offered. Calvin Sterling rode from homestead to homestead with contracts in his saddlebag. He offered loans against land tools and future stock. Men who once laughed at Clary now signed papers with shaking hands. Dr. Isaiah Freeman began finding sickness where hunger had weakened people first. "Children can live on thin soup longer than grown men think," he told Clary, "but not forever." On her 10 acres, the basin shrank but remained alive. Water continued seeping upward through the clay. Sedges stayed green. Clover thickened along the banks. The geese grazed, swam, and grew broad across the breast. Their gray down became clean white and silver feathers. Riders slowed when they passed. No one called it Clary's Wallow anymore. Some stared with admiration. Others stared as if her success had personally wronged them. Then the Northern Pacific Party came through Rosebud Crossing. Its chef, Etienne Dubois, entered the mercantile, demanding domestic geese for a railway director's supper. Virgil Gable spread his hands. "There isn't a fat animal left within 50 miles. Ben stood near the meal barrels with a sack of cornmeal. "I know where there are some," he said. An hour later, he led Dubois onto Clary's land. The Frenchman stopped when he saw the flock. "Magnificent," he whispered. He walked among the geese with the concentration of a doctor studying their feathers, legs, and weight. "These are excellent Toulouse birds. I will take 5. He offered $2 silver for each one. Clary looked toward General and the others. In her mind, they were still wet creatures trembling beneath lantern light. Nels touched her shoulder. "You raised livestock, not pets." She chose 5 birds and accepted the coins. Dubois promised to return in a month. They mocked the cracks, he told her, because they could not see what was growing behind them. Clary paid her taxes the following morning. The clerk counted the silver twice. 3 days later, Sterling appeared at her gate. He offered to buy the flock the breeding rights and use of the basin. Clary refused. He doubled the offer. She refused again. "You have nearly 280 birds," he said casually. Clary's skin went cold. The flock could not be counted accurately from the road. "You crossed my fence," Sterling smiled without warmth. "Valuable property attracts attention. They are not yours. An unmarried woman cannot guard this many birds alone." Eliza watched him ride away. "I saw 2 of his men near the upper seep yesterday," she said. "He is looking at more than geese." The warning remained in Clary's mind until Patrick Rourke came to her gate at dusk. He looked smaller than she remembered. Dust had settled into the lines of his face. He held his hat in both hands. "Margaret and the little girl are sick," he said. "Dr. Freeman says they need broth." He took out a silver watch. "It was my father's. I'll trade it for 1 goose." Clary remembered his laughter. She remembered every word spoken outside the mercantile. For one bitter moment, she wanted the watch. She wanted him to feel the full weight of needing mercy from the woman he had humiliated. Then she thought of Ben kneeling beside Hoppy, patient and serious. She thought of a sick child waiting for her father to return. Clary folded Patrick's fingers over the watch. "I will not feed your family by starving you of the last thing your father left behind." She brought him a heavy goose. "Pay me after the rains. Money, hay, labor, whatever you have then." Patrick's eyes filled. He walked away carrying the bird against his chest. By the following week, families were coming to Clary's gate. With Freeman's help, she gave food first to the sick. Some paid in coins. Others promised firewood, flour repairs, or winter feed. Eliza contributed dried berries and meat. Nels calculated how many breeding birds must remain. Ben recorded every exchange in Clary's father's old account book. At the mercantile, Patrick told the truth. She fed my family when she had every reason not to. Sterling stood in the corner and listened. That night, Ben returned late to check Hoppy's leg. On the ridge above the basin, 2 hooded lanterns moved through the sagebrush. He followed them. Hidden behind a cottonwood, he watched Sterling's riders drive their shovels into the earth beside the feeder seep. "Lower it before the assessor comes," one man said. Water began slipping into a new ditch. Ben tore strips from his shirt and tied them to the brush along the path. Then he turned toward Clary's homestead and ran. Ben reached Clary's yard before dawn with blood on one knee and half his shirt torn into strips. He struck the cabin door with both fists. "Clary, wake up." She opened it, holding a lantern, her hair loose over her shoulders. Behind him, the basin lay black beneath the paling sky, its geese murmuring uneasily. What happened? "Sterling's men." Bun bent over, fighting for breath. "They're cutting a ditch above the seep. I heard them say they had to lower the water before the assessor came." Clary seized her boots and followed him toward the basin. The change was visible even in the weak light. A pale band of exposed mud circled the water. Roots that had been submerged the previous evening now lay uncovered. The geese crowded the remaining pools, shoving and calling as though they understood something had been stolen during the night. Eliza arrived before sunrise. She knelt at the waterline and drove her fingers into the clay. "This did not happen by itself," she said. Bun showed them the strips he had torn from his shirt to mark the trail. Clary wanted to scold him for following armed men alone, but the fear in his face stopped her. "You could have been hurt. I couldn't let them take the water." Clary put both hands on his shoulders. "You tell me first next time. Courage does not mean giving your life away because no one is watching." Nels came carrying Clary's father's old deed box. Dr. Freeman followed in his wagon, summoned by Patrick Rourke. They had barely inspected the lowered basin when hoofbeats sounded on the road. Calvin Sterling rode through the gate beside Town Assessor Edwin Pritchard. 2 company riders followed. One of them had dried clay on his boots. Sterling dismounted with a leather folder beneath his arm. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "we have a serious matter to discuss." Behind him, people began arriving from Rosebud Crossing. Patrick came first, then Virgil Gable, then families. Clary had fed during the worst weeks of the drought. They gathered near the barn, uncertain and silent. Sterling opened his folder. "The basin on this property is connected to the district watershed. Your flock has consumed and contaminated water needed by the public. As you can plainly see, the supply is failing." He pointed toward the exposed mud. "I have petitioned for the birds to be impounded until the danger is resolved. The flock may be sold with proceeds distributed among the valley's creditors." Clary looked at the prepared papers. "You wrote that before the water fell." Sterling smiled. "A responsible man anticipates disaster. A responsible man does not manufacture it." The company riders shifted in their saddles. Pritchard cleared his throat. "Miss Whitcomb, accusations will not help. Mr. Sterling has maps and a sworn statement." Dr. Freeman stepped forward. "Then he should also have facts." He removed his spectacles and wiped the dust from them. "I have examined the basin, the birds, and the families eating meat from this flock. There is no evidence of contamination. The geese are healthy. The basin is not the town well. Confiscating these animals would deepen the food crisis, not relieve it." Sterling looked him over coldly. "You are a physician, not a surveyor. I know the difference between disease and hunger. I have treated both." Eliza walked to the edge of the group. "I have traveled this water since before your company knew the valley existed," she said. "The seep does not fall this quickly unless its path is blocked." Sterling lifted one of his maps. "Do you possess a legal survey number? I possess eyes." A few people murmured. Sterling turned toward Clary. "This is precisely the trouble. Sentiment, guesswork, and a woman too attached to livestock to understand restraint." His gaze moved deliberately over her body. "You have kept hundreds of birds while your neighbors starved. Perhaps moderation has never been your strength." The old shame struck Clary with surprising force. For years, men had used her body to end arguments she had not been allowed to begin. They called her too much when they wanted her silent, and not enough when she claimed knowledge. She felt every eye upon her. This time she did not look away. "You came for the water," she said. "Leave my body out of it." Sterling's mouth hardened. "Your judgment is the matter before us," no, Patrick Rourke said. He stepped from the crowd hat crushed in his hands. Her judgment fed my wife and daughter. He faced the town. I laughed when she carried those eggs home. I said they were rotten. Then I came here with my father's watch because my children were hungry. His voice broke, but he continued. She gave me a goose and let me keep the watch. Sterling offered to ease my debt if I said her birds made my family sick. I refused him. Other voices rose. She gave us credit. She took roof work instead of money. She fed my boy when he had fever. Pritchard lowered the paper slightly. Nels opened the deed box and unfolded a yellow document. These are the original boundary notes, he said. The basin and upper seep belong to the Whitcomb parcel. Sterling barely glanced at them. Private use may still be restricted during an emergency. The lowered water proves mismanagement. Ben pushed through the adults. Then why did your men dig a ditch in the dark? Silence fell. Sterling looked down at him. Go home, boy. I saw them. Ben pointed toward the ridge. I marked the trail. One rider turned his horse toward the road. Patrick caught the bridle. You can wait. Bunn led Eliza Nels Pritchard and several townsmen up the ridge. Clary remained beside the basin, listening to the geese call as Sterling watched the path with a face emptied of confidence. They returned carrying a shovel stamped with the cattle company's mark. There's a fresh channel, Pritchard said. The original flow was blocked with clay. The younger rider swung down from his horse. I only did what Mr. Sterling ordered, he said quickly. He said no one would care about a mud hole owned by a woman. The crowd turned toward Sterling. He closed his folder. This valley will not survive on sentiment, he said. Companies like mine will decide what happens here, not a girl with a few birds. Clary stepped toward him. She thought of broken shells lying in mud, of lantern smoke and sleepless nights, of Patrick's silver watch, of Ben running through darkness to save water that did not belong to him. You called me too large when you wanted me ashamed and too small when you wanted what was mine. Today, I am neither. I am standing exactly where I belong. No one laughed. Pritchard tore the impoundment order across the middle. Sterling mounted beneath the town's silent gaze. He rode out with his riders behind him, their horses throwing dust over the road he had once traveled like a king. The victory did not refill the basin. Everyone climbed the ridge. Eliza found the natural channel. Nels directed the men setting stones along its bank. Patrick swung a shovel until his hands bled. Ben packed wet clay into the leaks. Dr. Freeman bandaged a woman's palm after a rock split it open. Clary worked in the deepest part of the cut, lifting stones against her hip and setting them where Eliza pointed. By sunset, water began trickling toward the basin. The geese gathered at the returning stream, dipping their bills into it and shaking silver droplets from their heads. A cool wind moved through the cottonwoods. Clary smelled rain before she felt it. The first drop struck the dust beside her boot. Another darkened the shoulder of her dress. Then the sky opened. No one ran for shelter. Rain washed the dirt from Ben's face. Patrick knelt in the mud and covered his eyes. Eliza lifted her chin toward the clouds. Nels stood with both hands resting on his shovel. Clary remained in the basin while water ran through her hair and over her broad shoulders. The drought did not vanish in a single night, but the valley had begun to breathe again. By autumn, Patrick had repaid his debt with hay and labor. Nels helped enlarge the barn. Dr. Freeman established a food reserve in the church cellar. Eliza arranged trades for feathers, preserved meat, and breeding pairs. Families planted beans, root vegetables, and hardy grain instead of trusting their lives entirely to cattle. Ben continued coming every afternoon. At the first frost, he found a white feather caught in a willow branch and placed it in Clary's hand. Nels watched the geese moving through silver grass. A cracked shell is not a grave, he said. Clary turned the feather between her fingers. No, she answered. Sometimes it is only the first door life has to break through. Morning light spread across the basin. Behind her, the barn once expected to fill with rot was loud with life.